Good afternoon, Christopher Barron, Barron's America More in Common. I want to give you, my listeners, a bit of background on the overall More in Common theme and how I came up with the theme and the projects and a bit of my background. So to begin with, in the mid-2000s, I'd been an investigative journalist and a publisher. I was running companies and raising two children. And I saw things happening in the country that just didn't make sense to me. I saw systems unable to meet their missions. I saw homelessness in a way I'd never seen it before. And I just saw destabilization. I saw the polarization in politics and religion and values. And so, like a lot of other writers and thinkers before me, I thought the best way to understand what I was seeing in the country was to go out on the road and talk to Americans. So I was following the road in the footsteps of Kerouac and On the Road, Charles Kuralt, all the famous Americans who had essentially did what I was going to do, which is go out and simply talk to Americans and see the country and see the landscape and see what the tenor of the country was. So in 2010, I actually pulled out an old Rand McNally map and a paper map, and I drew a line around the edge of the country, the perimeter, and that was my route. And I chose that route for, I guess, several reasons. One, it was beautiful, diverse. It also, I think, the perimeter theme to me was, even then, a delineation, an edge of our country, our politics, our values, our culture. So I began the trip in 2010, the initial trip with my daughter actually, and did from Colorado along the southern border up the west coast Pacific Highway to San Francisco and back. Really fun father-daughter trip, and but it wasn't really, the research was not as robust perhaps as I might have really envisioned for the trip. So in the intervening years, I would pick away at the trip, and in the end, I traveled well over 20,000 miles, 25,000 miles, and I embedded in cities across the country for up to 8 months, 10 months, a year at a time. In total, I think I've spent 3+ years of my life embedded in cities, plus the travel. And I finished it a year and a half ago. I finished it during the election, I guess it was. The final section from here to Bar Harbor and south. And I've had this very, very rare look at this period in American history. And I say that, it's the finest thing I've ever done. It was such a privilege to travel the country and to talk to Americans. And, at times, it was a quick conversation, and then they might become more in depth. And then sometimes I'd end up staying in a city, and I've even had people invite me to their homes. And, over the years, I was witness to the birth of the country and the world in which we live. It was an astounding experience. And for those of you who are wondering, the trip was elongated due to some very difficult to diagnose health issues. And very, very frustrating. I think the book would have been out in 15 maybe, so that's 11 years ago. But it provided me with an unparalleled look at this period in history, changes in our economy, changes in systems, and it gave me a look at scale. And it also provided me with a view of different strata of society, different economic demographics, and at times, frankly, a very painful look at our shortcomings as a nation. During this time of incredible wealth creation, unparalleled in human history, I frequently met people who were left behind and simply had no chance at the American dream, and frankly, oftentimes no chance at even less than that. A time of profound disruption in every domain, systems often incapable of delivering what their mission is, incredible wealth creation and accumulation with 1,000 billionaires in America. And a certain percentage of Americans have done very, very well. But as I traveled, it was impossible to not view the issues at scale. I've been very fortunate to live in beautiful places, and my peer group is a fairly successful peer group. But I was privileged to meet people who came from very different backgrounds and had very different lives than me at times. And it was really a window into the changes, how they've been amplified. And certainly at times I function as a sociologist, a psychologist, an economist. You're delving into these things and you're having these long conversations with people. And you're seeing that cities across the country and people across the country were dealing with the same challenges. And the disruption was simply astounding. And things were moving so fast. Technology was moving so fast that for a certain segment of Americans, it's been the best time to be alive in human history. You can create things you couldn't create before in the time frame we're doing them. So in that sense, as a capitalist, it was really a wonderful, wonderful experience. And for me, it was, I say that you can barely travel a street in America and not trip over opportunity. The challenge I saw was, well, among many, was that so many Americans weren't equipped. That wasn't what they did. I realized that, education, intelligence, family background, health, community, these factors, these societal issues, all determine oftentimes the trajectory of a person's life. And so as I kept on doing this, I finished the final portions, and it was kind of a non-event and kind of a sad event for me when I finished it. I've had a very up-close look at healthcare in several states. I've had amazing healthcare, world-class, boutique medicine at times. And other times, I was privy to a healthcare system that's simply ridiculous. It makes no sense. The number of errors and insurance issues, complexities to navigate it. Healthcare, I think, of anything, and let me just riff off of that. My interests are actually human flourishing. Right now, many, many Americans are flourishing in ways, and yet oftentimes some of the wealthiest are discontent, unhappy, seeking more. And I think that probably has always been some element of truth, but it's on steroids now. Then I meet people who, our middle class is pretty much gone. The middle class is gone that I grew up with. In my teens and 20s, I come from a family of small business owners. Everyone owned a home. No one, this was a stable life. More than one was a millionaire in the 80s, okay? And these were just basic small businesses. They lived in the same home. There was nothing flashy about any of my family. One exception. But then as I'm traveling, I'm seeing that there's changes where people aren't able to get up the ladder. They, even with a college degree, the number of people I met who had degrees were oftentimes flailing. These systems were changing, they were becoming complex, and the impact of technology, I really don't know how to describe. It's at the cellular level right now. It's changed every aspect of our lives. And that's been a good thing in many ways. For example, we do research in medicine. We're number one in the world for research. I believe in trauma as well. But in many other metrics for healthcare, we trail comparable countries. Many, many Americans would be far better off in Europe if they're not entrepreneurial and can't create businesses and wealth, because right now the entire country is destabilized and our healthcare system has changed so much since the 80s and 90s. So with me, on one hand, my physician might spend an hour with me. That's not the norm across America, is what I'm told. Now, I've got a bit of a complex situation in the past year, surgery and some other things. But, when I got back, you cannot look at the technology and be in awe. At the same time, I couldn't be terrified by what's happening with AI in ways, even though I'm using it, because I talked to people, AI professionals years ago, and we knew where this could potentially go. And Perimeter really became a private think tank. It became a look at society, culture, health, these complex systems. Going back to Flourishing, the reason I created both the More in Common Dinner Club and More in Common Ventures is to address the shortcomings I witnessed across America. And let me just maybe divert here a second to where I saw as far as systems. There is no shortage of brilliant people in America. There's no shortage of driven people, and there's no shortage of capital. There's no shortage of people wanting to do good in this country. As I traveled, in addition to the people who were less fortunate, I met brilliant people, Ivy League graduates constantly, venture capitalists, business founders, great success stories. So the American dream was real for my generation. It's real for some in this generation. But what's different is, and maybe just finish my thought, across the country I saw systems and solutions and nonprofits trying to do good, but what was happening during this creation of wealth, kind of unseen or uncared about, were people who weren't keeping up. They were in a foot race they couldn't keep up with. And their lives are becoming destabilized. We had changes in housing. We had changes, obviously, in healthcare. We had changes in family structure. We had changes in values. Certainly technology and devices and social media have profoundly altered our narrow pathways and how we relate with one another. So again, a lot of this technology is benefiting a certain percentage of people who are able to harness it. But it's oftentimes, in my experience, harming a lot of people as well, or they don't have the ability to adopt. Both More in Common Ventures and More in Common Dinner Club are designed to address a few things. Let me start with the dinner club. As I traveled, I would throw these coffee groups serendipitously. And they were like, 8, 10 people having coffee. It was in Palo Alto to begin with, then in Boulder, and then some other cities. And that was the beginning of the More in Common Dinner Club. I got back to Aspen in the pandemic, started hosting them at my home, and they were love fests. They went back to the dinner parties I'd hosted when I was earlier in my life, that I had with my family, and people were marked, look, we don't do this much anymore. We don't dine like this, we don't talk like this. And I realized that I was doing something uncommon. I mean, it was just people were remarking across the country. So this has been now a multi-year effort to get these into the public space nationally. And the goal is this with the dinner club, healing the divide one meal at a time. Well, what's happened partially with devices, and I'm now at 13 minutes here, so I'll try to keep this a bit concise. I'll meet HR people, directors. They're having trouble hiring people because they say, look, these young men and women, they really don't have great communication skills. But then, of course, oftentimes I know 20 and 30-somethings who have amazing communication skills. Again, if you look at the aggregate, that's where the changes are really kind of measurable. But the dinner club is meant as a forum, a place, my take on Jeffersonian dinners, to get together, have a good meal, and, is it a structured event? Well, the beauty of what I did at my home was they weren't really structured, but the conversation was amazing. So, it's a dance because is there a structure like, do we want to discuss freedom tonight? Do we want to discuss surveillance? Do we want to discuss how our own community is doing? Sure, we can structure them, but to me the value is across the country, and this is across demographics, people were lonely, they were isolated. And I said you had to design your life as this went on. You had to curate friendship, curate social groups. So they're meant to be a place for, yes, robust, polite, respectful discourse, but at the same time, they are a social touch point. They're also a place where people can get together and talk about the challenge their communities are facing on the ground. I think that, and they also importantly, we become so attenuated to being offended, to being incapable of listening, to a circuit in our brain going off, oh, Joe or Jane, I got to leave the table. That's a privilege. And I'm not sure it's always a good one. If we lose the ability to listen to one another, one of the best things I learned as I crossed the country was I talked to people from every stripe. I talked to revolutionaries, I talked to liberals, Democrats, libertarians, capitalists, everyone, homeless people, drug addicts, you name it. And, there's a whole host of values in talking to people unlike yourself. There's oftentimes wisdom in places you wouldn't find it, but also I guess it creates a mental, well, let's call it restraint. We can go to Stoicism. Restraint. Can I control my emotions? Can I control my responses? And what social media has done in many ways is erased or diminished our ability to do that. So that's the More in Common Dinner Club, and I'm very, very excited. I'll be seeding these across my trip. More in Common Ventures. If I'm in Palo Alto, I'm in La Jolla, Carlsbad, LA, if I'm in New York, Miami Beach, Boulder, Bozeman, Austin, these ecosystems are amazing. The wealth created, the businesses created, astounding. But most Americans don't live in those ecosystems. And most Americans aren't that well educated. I could pull the percentages. And arguably, everyone's not that driven. One of the best things I think that's happened with the common knowledge now, we have access to human psychology and psychological traits and how we're all wired and understanding one another is, we're so different, which I find interesting because, of course, the theme is more in common. Well, the fact is we're radically different from one another, but we share the same desires oftentimes. Most humans in general want love. They want community, meaning, purpose. There's the outliers who want extreme wealth. They're Olympic athletes, they're CEOs, they're corporate raiders, scientists who discover amazing breakthroughs. But I guess a question I have is, and this is a question, it's foundational to my book, Perimeter and Odyssey. It's foundation to my retreat company. It's foundation to everything I'm doing. A friend of mine's a Marine, retired Vietnam Air, and he used a really good phrase, a rational social fabric. And when I grew up, and I'm certainly, at this point in my life, maybe some rose-colored glasses, but there was a rational social fabric. Everyone I knew owned a home. Everyone I knew had extended family. You would often just go by someone else's house unannounced and have a cup of coffee or a beer. There were public meeting spaces that weren't predicated upon paying a lot for drinks or dinners. And so there was the commons, right? But my question is, and this is with the dinners and even with More in Common Ventures, what kind of society do we want? Do we want a society where we have a class of people who have unfathomable wealth, and we have far too many Americans who simply have no way to compete? They're missing life's basics. They're constantly in terror of losing their job or becoming ill or being bankrupted by healthcare. Or let's take a step up. If you look at how social media has changed our brains, well, looking at let's call it midlife, right? Well, midlife, which is where I would be, I meet a lot of unhappy or certainly lonely people. Our families have changed for the most part. There's some exceptions. How we relate to one another, how we socialize. And, a friend of mine the other day said, we had so much fun back then. And certainly there are people having that, but as I travel, I just don't meet that many people. I say that during this 14-year period between 2010 and 2016, so it's a 60-year period at this point, is there any ease in life? Is there any time we're not competing with one another? Is there any time when we're not like hitting home runs and going for the fences? And as a capitalist, like, it's amazing, right? But I guess to me, at what cost? And it's kind of like some people sign up for that. Like, some people want to be a Navy SEAL. Some people want to be a fighter pilot, right? They chart their course. But do we want a society that only benefits the people at the edges? And I would argue that even people not at the edges. So More in Common Ventures is designed to, I'm getting to this point probably late in this, I hope you sort of stayed with me. More in Common Ventures is picking up the slack and systems. We're saying, look, I met so many people who were on the edge. They were one paycheck away from losing their apartment or their rental home. Now again, but even at times, people's homes, right? Health is a common thing that takes people out in this country. But More in Common Ventures' point is saying, look, let's get ahead of this. Let's do it at scale, okay? And the pain points it's addressing is this: 10 pilot cities minimum, 2027, let's call it 2028. If someone's in danger, stabilizing communities, if someone's in danger of losing their home or their house due to an episodic event, which I know happens, and I've known these people. I want to give you a tragic example. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I have a friend in the medical industry, and her comment was, hey, did you hear so-and-so commit suicide? I said, no, I didn't know that. And she said, can you imagine a young guy killing himself over $5,000? Now, she didn't know, she knew a little bit, but she didn't know about my circumnavigation and the number of interviews I'd done. And the answer, if I would have said to her, honestly, was, I'm not surprised at all. Across America, I interviewed people, social services, medicine, emergency responders, psychologists, police officers, you name it, I interviewed them. And so keep people housed. Then secondly, if someone's lost housing and they're ready to get back into it, low friction grant. Stability is key. We live in a destabilized world, in a destabilized society, and our government arguably is functionally destabilized. A lot of acquaintances say, well, people don't want to give money and we're very judgmental. I've designed More in Common Ventures where there's no taxes involved. This is not about taxing people who don't want to be taxed. This is saying, what kind of community do we want? So, housing. Health. I'll give you a quote. Doctor friend of mine. No one in this country should lose their home, go bankrupt due to health care, or be saddled with debt. I was on the phone with a billing agent from a hospital once, and she said to me, Christopher, look, imagine you don't have a smartphone. Imagine you're ill or injured or sick and you're essentially not able to function, and you have to dig in and dispute this bill. People don't recover from this. it just shouldn't happen in this country. So housing, healthcare. Number 3, across America, as I said earlier, we have untold opportunity in this country. But we need to be aware that not everybody is wired to be entrepreneurial. Not everybody is wired to run a business. But for those that are, and as we have AI arriving as we speak, and I'm very, very pessimistic about it's going to amplify the divide in wealth. It's going to benefit the people who can utilize it and create a gulf. How do we span this gap here? In my little valley I live in, this rural valley in Colorado, I constantly meet young people starting businesses. There are 2 groups. They come from well-off families who have access to capital, and this is classic across America. I don't know how many friends have kids in their 20s starting tech companies or some kind of company. One friend's son just got $4 million in venture funding after he sold the company. That's one group. But there's another group. They're the people who are starting basic businesses. Okay, so we look at the crisis of men that Scott Galloway and I've been talking about that the young men are having. But here's the thing, I don't meet those young men very often. I actually meet really solid 20 and 30 something year olds. And here's the thing, in a changing world, we're going to need physical work, we're going to need service work. There's a million different things that people can do, small businesses. And the reason this resonates with me is my family they weren't physicists. They weren't software engineers. They built businesses that in some cases lasted a generation. And that business created dignity, it gave them standing in their community, it paid for their home, their vacation homes, and everyone left an inheritance, no matter how big or small. A lot of Americans today, they don't have access to capital. So let's say they want to start something simple like a trucking firm with one truck. I met a young Hispanic guy at the DMV, 30 years old. He's buying his first truck. He gave me his whole business plan. He said, well, I'm going to plan. He's already doing it. Okay, we need to have people in our society, young people, certainly, but here's another demographic, is AI impacts our workforce. How many people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and maybe even 70s, who've been in jobs they've been doing their whole lives, are going to not have enough for retirement? But they can start a small business. So the final component, it's actually not the final one, but for today's purposes, low friction grants to start basic, low risk businesses. You know, one thing I'll say about entrepreneurship that has been remarkable to me for many, many years is this. No one in my family would have ever called themselves an entrepreneur, and yet they all were. No one started speculative businesses. No one. I didn't know anybody whose business failed. Now, I didn't have a family from the restaurant industry, but you know, everybody's business succeeded. They employed people, they raised their kids, and as I said, several died in the 80s with about $1 million net worth, and then maybe a little bit more. Today that would be, I haven't calculated recently. So housing stability, medical, and business creation. If you look at a society, and I'm getting to 29 minutes here, we need to stabilize societies locally. We cannot obviously count on our elected officials to do the heavy lifting because we're in gridlock. That means that it's on us and our communities, right, to participate. Now, let me end with something that, 2 words. And I'm not the only person saying this. I think David Brooks has said this, Sebastian Junger, I think Russ Dohat, courage and values. Our wealth We have so much wealth. I have a company that it's a retreat company, and it's aimed at people. They're well-off people in beautiful places. They're small groups, so it's difficult to do cheaply. We have so much wealth, but a question I have is, what have we become? How can we have so much wealth and oftentimes be so insatiable, so unhappy, so self-centered? Well, again, look at how we're wired, right? And then look at how our society, look at our infrastructure, look at our housing, how it's designed. This is all foundational. I'm afraid I'm gonna run out here. Courage, kindness, values. It's a question. I don't have the answer. It's not my decision. It's all of our decisions. What kind of community do we want to have? How do we want to show up? If we want to show up at all for our neighbors, do we care? I mean, it's a common refrain for 14 years. It's gotten worse and worse and worse. I don't care. The easy warmth and friendship and collaboration and looking out for one another that I grew up with is gone, right? So, More in Common Dinner Club, More in Common Ventures, leaving about the 10th, 3,000 miles. I'm raising a lot of money. This is going to raise money to allow me to form these organizations that are national. I invite you to join me, and if you'd like to have me speak, you can reach out. If you want to host a More in Common Dinner Club event, reach out. Certainly, there'll be tons of social media and other media attention. But I think that is this the country we want? And if it isn't, what kind of country do we want? And I guess more importantly, and more poignantly to me, who are we? Who are you? What do you want to be? And is the life we're living as a country and as citizens in our communities, are we proud of it? Are we proud? And I'm going to leave it at that. It's 32 minutes. Thank you so much. Best from the Rocky Mountains, Colorado.